Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, an ongoing study in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to take a look at a very important lesson today. This is the midpoint lesson. We're going to reach 8:29, the midpoint verse, when Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. But let's go to the text and take a look at it first. In block 1, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking around." Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ." That verse, 8:29, is the midpoint in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, we are going to transition now. As we mentioned in last lesson, we're going to transition from objective spirit to subjective spirit. The first half of Mark is dedicated to objective ministry to the Gentiles, the realm of objective spirit, and the work of the Spirit in objective ministry. But now we're talking about a transition to subjective spirit and the work of the Spirit in the inner self, especially the inner self of the apostles, who must learn a new way of thinking, who must learn and develop a spiritual mindset, a phronema pneumatikos. So let's go to the commentary, and I want you to pay special attention to Edwards. He really does an excellent job of interpreting things subjectively here. And this is going to be what we do in the second half of the Gospel of Mark. We are moving into subjective spirit. We are leaving objective spirit. We are entering the realm of subjective spirit. Let's go to Ruckman first, though. Mark emphasizes that having the healing took place because of Christ's spoken word. To see men like trees means that men die like trees to the old self. Men are resurrected like trees in the spring. Men bear fruit like trees. Christ comes for his bride in the spring. Solomon 2. Jesus was first introduced to Peter as the Christ in John 1:41. He still held that opinion. After objective ministry to the Gentiles, he still held that opinion. Now, a very special commentary by Edwards, and I really appreciated what Edwards did here. I thought he was very, very good, especially with this transition we now enter into. We enter into the realm of subjective spirit. The healing of blindness is spiritually and subjectively interpreted as the lingering blindness of the disciples. Take note of that. Take note of that. The healing of blindness is spiritually and subjectively interpreted as the lingering blindness of the disciples. In this healing episode, Christ is bringing the sacred to the profane. Jesus' question, "Do you see anything?" needs to be interpreted subjectively and referenced back to his question to the disciples, do you still not see? Back there in verse 17 in our previous lesson. The disciples will be enabled by Christ to move from their spiritual blindness to conceptual noeo, spiritual knowing, spiritual perception. The two-stage cure should be interpreted subjectively, again, as the process of revelation. It is a progressive process of revelation that we internalize as we are participants in the realm of subjective spirit. And we are now entering the second half. We're entering Book 2 of the Gospel of Mark. We've finished Book 1. That's why some commentaries actually write two separate volumes for the Gospel of Mark, because 8:29 is a decisive split in the Gospel, and it is a decisive transition from the objective realm of spirit to the subjective realm of spirit. And so I like what Edwards did. He says, this should be subjectively interpreted. This should be subjectively interpreted. And he's right. This is the transition point. From now on, Christ is concerned about developing a spiritual mindset in the subjective consciousness of the disciples. It's a process. It's going to be a process, but Christ wants to create a new way of thinking in the disciples, a spiritual phronema mindset, a phronema pneumatikos. Phronema, Greek for mindset, pneumatikos, Greek for spiritual. He wants to develop in the disciples a phronema pneumatikos. And therefore, this episode of healing is really to be referenced back to the questions put to the disciples. Do you still not see? Verse 17. This healing episode needs to be linked in a spiritual and subjective way back to verse 17. Do you still not see? Have you still not reached spiritual noeo, spiritual conceptual thinking? Now, we're going to look at the Greek in verse 29 because it is the central, pivotal verse in the entire gospel where we have the confession by Peter, and it is the transition from Book 1 of Mark to Book 2. From objective, the realm of objective spirit, we now transition to the realm of subjective spirit. This is our first lesson in the realm of subjective spirit and subjective learning and reaching toward subjective spiritual self-consciousness, or in the Greek, noeo. So verse 29, and he questioned them, who do you pronounce me to be? Answering, Peter says to him, Su I ha Christos, you are the Christ. Su I ha Christos, you are the Christ. You are ha Christos, the Christ. And that's not quite the end of chapter 8. We've got one more lesson before we finish up 8. But critically important is put a big circle around Block 2, Note 2, all of the commentary by Edwards. And I'm going to read through it again because it's the key. It launches our journey into the realm of subjective spirit. Let me go through it again. The healing of blindness is spiritually and subjectively to be interpreted as the lingering spiritual blindness of the disciples. In this healing episode, Christ is bringing the sacred to the profane. He's bringing spiritual thinking to carnal thinking. Jesus' question, "Do you see anything?" needs to be interpreted subjectively in reference to his previous question to the disciples, "Do you still not see?" in verse 17. The disciples will be enabled by Christ to move from their spiritual blindness to conceptual noeo, spiritual knowing. The two-stage cure should be interpreted subjectively also as the ongoing process of internalizing revelation. The disciples are to progressively and continually internalize the teaching of Christ. They are to internalize their relationship to Christ. They are to internalize discovery of the new in Christ until they reach noeo, conceptual, spiritual thought, until they reach phronema pneumatikos, a spiritual mindset. We are on a journey. We've left the realm of objective spirit. We have left the ministry to the objective territory of the Gentiles in the first half of Mark, and now we are on the way to Jerusalem, and Christ is concerned about raising the level of self-consciousness of the apostles. Now Christ is dedicated to deliberate and intense teaching to raise the level of spiritual self-consciousness of the apostles. And the very next lesson is going to key in on that, because it's going to be about the Messiah as the suffering servant. Next lesson is going to be the Messiah as the suffering servant. And that's going to be 8:34 to 8:38. That will finish up chapter 8. So 8:34 to 8:38 next time. But what is critical this time is to recognize the title to Block 2. That's the key. We now, in this lesson, this is lesson 1 of book 2 in the Gospel of Mark. We now transition from the realm of objective spirit to the realm of subjective spirit. It begins with this lesson. 8:22 to 8:29 is an intense and deliberate and a definite marker for a transition from the realm of objective spirit to the realm of subjective spirit and the raising of subjective spiritual self-consciousness in the apostles. For the rest of the Gospel of Mark, Christ will be intensely seeking to raise the spiritual self-consciousness of all of the apostles, to get them to think in a new way, to get them to reach phronema pneumatikos, a spiritual mindset, and to internalize the process of revelation and let it imprint their heart and their mind. And this is the first lesson where we learn about subjective interpretation. And it's all right there in Block 2, Note 2, with Edwards. Edwards has superb commentary here. And he gives us the big picture. It's important to have the big picture when we look at the Gospel of Mark. That's why sometimes commentators have 2 volumes for the Gospel of Mark in their commentary, because there are 2 distinct parts to the Gospel of Mark. And now we know that we are headed to the realm of subjective spirit after having formerly left the realm of objective spirit and ministry to the Gentiles Now we attain and move toward the realm of subjective spirit and interpreting the remainder of the Gospel of Mark within the realm of subjective spirit. That's going to wrap up chapter 8, 22 through 29 on an extremely important first lesson in part 2 of the Gospel of Mark. First lesson in part 2 of the Gospel of Mark.